Welcome to Cabinet Building 101 at the Southern Craft Wood Shop. In this video, I'll share the techniques to build a simple yet sturdy, cosmetically pleasing vanity cabinet. And I might even share a few tips and tricks along the way. Hey guys, I'm Wes Lewis and I'll be your tour guide today. What do you say let's jump right in and get started? For paint grade face frames, I like to use hard maple. We'll start with the rip blade on the table saw, double check to be sure the blade is set to 90 degrees, and then we'll set the fence to 2 inches. I purchased my maple as a dressed 1x6 with a good factory edge. I'll get two 2-inch rips per board and a drop that's approximately 1.25 inches wide. Once all of our rips are made, it's time to head over to the miter saw. Just like at the table saw, we'll make sure the blade is set perfectly to 90 degrees and we'll check the cross cut as well. I'll set my bump stop to the desired length, trim my rough end, then bump to my stop and make my cut. I like to work from the longest cut down to the smallest, and I'm filming somewhere in the middle of my cut ticket here. Setting a bump stop is very important for making repeated cuts of the same size. If you don't have a bump stop, you can make one with a scrap block of wood and a few screws. I like to use a Phillips head screw for the bump itself for ease of adjustment. Once all of our face frame parts are cut, I'll set up my Kreg pocket hole jig. I'll drill 2 holes in the back of each of my rails and my 1 middle stile. For assembly, we'll use Kreg's 1.25 inch pocket hole screws. I'll go ahead and lay out all of the parts we need along with the tools and the drawings. Working from the back side, we'll assemble the basic frame, screwing the top and bottom rails to the outside vertical stiles. Next, we'll use the mid rails to set the spacing for our middle stile. With our mid stile in place, we'll mount our mid rails using spacer blocks. I use a 5-inch opening for my top drawers. Now we can mount our second mid rail in our drawer stack. Our 7 3/4 spacer block will give us equal spacing for our bottom 2 openings. Our sink will have a false drawer front, so we'll need 2 5-inch mounting blocks in that opening. Well, it looks like it's snack time, and that's as good a time as any to make our cut tickets for our 3/4 inch plywood parts. We need to change our rip blade we used earlier back over to a combination blade before we cut any plywood. I'll work my way through the cut ticket, making all of my rips first, then use the crosscut sled to trim all of my parts down to length. Well, my snack from earlier has pretty much burnt out. Let me go see if Miss Laura's got anything cooked for supper. I'm going to start day 2 with a cup of coffee, knock the cobwebs out, and I'll lay out a bulkhead for notches around our stretchers and nailers. We'll use a jigsaw to make short work of these notches. Now we can shoot our toe kick together, and I make it 1/8 inch narrower than the width of the cabinet bottom. I also make them 5 1/4 inches tall, and that'll leave us with 4 inches worth of height in toe kick when it's all said and done. To lay out for the cabinet body, I'll place our cabinet bottom on the table and use a scrap of plywood on its edge to set the spacing for the finished end. I'll flush our face frame to our spacer block, and then I'll mark the location for our bulkhead. Now we can use that mark to transfer our layout over to our nailers and our stretchers. We'll also use one of the stretchers to transfer the mark to the back of the bottom. Before we assemble our cabinet, I want to do some basic sanding on the back side of the face frame. I also want to be sure to get a good micro bevel on the back side of our finished end stile, as well as on our bottom rails where they meet the plywood bottom. We can now move on to assembling our cabinet body. Our face frames are 2 inches, so I'll take a 2-inch rip and I'll mark the bottom side of our end panels, both front and back. I'll apply some glue to the edge of the bottom, use the marks that we just made to line up our end panel to our bottom, and use 2-inch 18-gauge brads to fasten the end panels to the bottom. Now I want to transfer our layout marks for our bulkhead to the bottom side of the cabinet so we'll have a good reference point. I'll check to make sure all of the notches in the bulkhead are oriented properly, then we'll spread a little glue on the bottom and mount our bulkhead. Now we can mount our front stretcher. After that, I'll move to our back nailers and our back stretcher, and I'll be sure to use our layout marks from before to orient everything properly. It's also a good idea to have a moist rag available to help clean up any glue squeeze out. It's almost time to attach our face frame, but first I want to do a little sanding on the cabinet body. Again, I want to get a micro bevel on the front edge of the finished end, as well as the front top edge of the cabinet bottom. I'll spread a little glue on all the edges of the plywood, and then I'll take our face frame and gently set it in place. We'll work the finished end side first, being sure to keep everything flush, and you can start to see the results of that double micro bevel down that edge. Then we can move down and tack at the bulkhead, and then again at the non-finished end before shooting the entire face frame on firmly. My little rigid nailer does a good job, but every once in a while I'll have a uh-oh. This is easy enough to fix on a paint grade cabinet. Just snip the nail off, tap it in with the nail set, and if it's a finished location, add a little spackling. I'll spin the cabinet around to set the toe kick, and I like to use a 3/4 inch spacer off the back in case the contractor has already run his base. I'll shoot brads through the end panels. I'll check my spacing at the front of the toe kick, transfer some marks to the bottom, and then tack into the toe kick from the top of the bottom as well. For paint grade cabinets, I like to use spackling to fill the nail holes and to go over all of my seams in my face frame. I'll also fill in the groove we made with our micro bevels before coming back with the edge of the putty knife to give a good clean seam. After our spackling has had time to dry, it's time to sand, and sand, and sand some more. And I don't show it here, but I generally put a second coat of spackling over all of the nail holes just to be sure they're completely filled in. I want to be sure to get a nice eased edge on our finished end style, and then I'll take a little 120 grit just for some fine detail work. Now we'll set our cabinet over to the side and we'll start working on our drawers. Now I generally don't use plywood to build drawers, but there's really nothing wrong with it if you take a few extra steps, and I wanted to show that in this video. Just like if I was using solid stock, I'll spread some glue on the edge of our front and back. Then I'll shoot one side on, spin our box around, add some more glue, and then add the other side. Next I'll flip the box over, apply glue around all of the bottom edge, and set my 1/4 inch bottom in place. I'll use 1 inch staples, coming down one side first and using the bottom plywood to be sure my drawer is square. And I'll staple the bottom about every 2 inches all the way around. Now flip the drawer back over and use my damp rag to remove any excess glue, and then I'll fill in the nail holes with spackling. I'll also look at the top edge of the drawer box and fill any plywood voids in with spackling as well. Once our spackling is dry on all of our drawer boxes, it's time to sand, and pay close attention to make sure you get the edges of that plywood nice and smooth, as well as easing the corners just a little bit. I'm ready to start priming this project, and the very first thing I want to do is make sure I get a good coat of primer on those drawer plywood edges. Next I want to spray the back side of the doors and set those over to dry while we work on our cabinet body and put our first full coat on our cabinet drawers. Once the back side of our doors and drawer fronts dries, we'll flip them over. We'll make sure that there is no dust or debris in any of the cracks and crevices before we prime the front side. I purchased my doors and drawer fronts from a company that runs them on a CNC. If you'll do a little research, you shouldn't have any trouble finding a company that does this in your area. The primer that I use generally takes a couple of hours to dry, and I'll use that time to strain my paint and set up for my top coat. Once all of my primer is dry, it's time to sand, and sand, and sand some more. Be sure to take your time on this step because it greatly affects the finished product. After all that sanding, it's finally time to start top coating. Now I'm spraying white paint on top of white primer, and it's not that interesting to watch, so I'm only going to show a little bit of it. I've given our paint a day or two to fully cure, and it's time to start hardwaring this cabinet. I'll be using full extension drawer runners, and the first thing we need to do is separate the two components. Next I'll get a measurement from the bottom of the cabinet to the top of both of the rails in our drawer stack, and I'll go cut spacer blocks at the miter saw. I'll use these spacer blocks at the back side of the cabinet as well as the top side of the rails to set our drawer runners. And I'll be sure to flush the front of the drawer runners to the face of the cabinet. For our bottom runners, they'll set flush to the bottom of the cabinet. For the runners on the drawer box itself, I'll use a block of wood to bump the runner flush to the face of the front side of the drawer. To install the drawer boxes, I'll line the two components of the hardware up on either side of the drawer box and slide the drawer into place. This may be slightly stiff as it goes in the first time, but should not have to be forced. Now for the doors. I'll place the door face down on a blanket, and the hinge that I use mounts with a compression dowel. This can be pressed in or hammered in. I'll snap on one face frame mounting plate, and I'll get a dimension from the edge of the plate to the bottom of the door. I'm using a 1/2 inch overlay, and I'm measuring 2.5 inches. I'll use a 2-inch block as a spacer, and I'll screw the mounting plates into place. This should give us a 1/2 inch overlay at the bottom and the top when we're done. With the bottom mounting plate in place, I can use the door itself to set the spacing for the top mounting plate. The hinges I use have a wide range of adjustment. With the turn of a screwdriver, I can adjust the doors out perfectly. Now we can use 1-inch spacer blocks to mount the false front at the sink cabinet. I'll use a couple of 1.25-inch screws through our blocking into our false front. Now I generally mount my drawer fronts on site after I have installed the cabinet, but for the video I'm going to do it on the bench. It just makes it a little easier to record. I'm going to start by temporarily mounting an 1.5 inch block at the bottom edge of my rail. I've pre-drilled for my drawer handles, and I'll use those holes to temporarily screw the drawer front to the drawer box. I'll work my way from the bottom up, repeating this process on all 3 drawers. Now I can open the drawer and permanently screw the drawer front to the drawer box using 1.25 inch screws. Next, I'll remove the temporary screws on the front of the drawer. Then I'll use a 3/16 drill bit to drill the rest of the way through the drawer box. Now it's just a matter of sticking the screws through the holes and mounting your pulls. Keep in mind, depending on the thickness of your drawer front, you may have to have aftermarket screws that do not come with your hardware. Moving over to the doors, I'll use a jig and my drill to make a small indention before removing the jig and drilling all the way through the doors. Then I can mount the knobs, and I'll attach some bumpers on the back side of the door as well. That wraps up the building process. Now let's go install. As you can see, I've already removed the doors and drawers before we start installing. You'll also notice that I had to take a pretty good chunk out of the toe kick because of a bad floor situation. I'll slide the cabinet into the corner, and I'll check the level to make sure everything is sitting properly. Next, I'll get a mark on the backside wall just to make sure nothing moves between now and when we screw the cabinet to the wall. Now some of you are going to cringe at this part, but I find studs with a drill bit. I'd rather know exactly where the stud is than guessing with a stud finder. Next, I'll measure over 16 inches to get a rough idea of where my next stud is, and I'll repeat the process. As you can see, it's not always exactly 16 inches center to center. Now I'll be sure to stay on our control line and screw our cabinet to the wall using 2.5 inch or 3-inch screws. We need to cut out for our sink and our countertop, and the first thing I need to do is find center of our sink opening and then measure off the wall over to that mark. I'll transfer this dimension to the countertop itself, and I'll mark my center line on the countertop. I'll take the sink out of the box and I'll place it upside down on the countertop, and I'll find center at the front and back. I'll line those marks up, making sure I have my setback in the right location, and I'll trace around the outside edge of the sink. For this particular sink, I can set in about 3/4 to 7/8 of an inch all the way around, and I'll trace that out with a pencil. Now I'll drill through the countertop on the inside of my layout line and use a jigsaw to cut the sink hole out. We'll do a quick test fit before we take the countertop inside and set it in place. Once we like the fit, we'll screw the countertop down to the cabinet by screwing through the stretchers into the bottom side of the countertop. Now we'll use an adhesive caulk to mount our side splash to the wall. Once the side splash has had a little time to set up, we'll caulk it in with a little bit of colored caulk to match the laminate color. I'll run a bead of white caulk where our cabinet meets the wall at both the front and the side. We're going to finish out our toe kick with a piece of 1/4 inch painted white. I'll use a block to scribe our 1/4 inch to the floor before taking a jigsaw and making that cut. Next, I'll put our 1/4 inch in place, and I'll mark the edge that needs to be cut on the miter saw. I'll cut for the outside corner on the miter saw with the blade tilted to 45 degrees. Once I've done a test fit, I'll use a high strength spray adhesive to mount our 1/4 inch to our toe kick. We're ready to slide our drawers back in place and snap our doors back on, and we'll go ahead and drop the sink in place for the plumber. Well, that's how I build a vanity